I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project. Shroud of Turin research project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin.
Barrie Schwortz was an elite photographer for NASA who spent decades trying to prove the Shroud of Turin was a fake.
Instead, he ended up exposing DNA evidence that defies every law of biological degradation.
The lab discovered ancient sequences that are far too specific to be random contamination from medieval monks or Italian restorers. What most people do not realize is that the scientific establishment is actively avoiding these findings because they cannot explain them.
The shroud is an image of a crucified man with wounds that correspond to the brutality that Jesus of Nazareth experienced.
So why do you think it's real?
They cannot explain how the image is in the shroud.
The haunting image on this cloth was not painted, burned, or scorched.
And the DNA proves it. Here is the deal. This discovery might be the most controversial find in human history.
The forbidden evidence behind the shroud. What most people do not realize is that the sheer variety of
The DNA
suggests the cloth was handled by hundreds of people across vast distances before it ever arrived in Europe. But get this.
The most recent tests show that some of the DNA is so old and so degraded that it couldn't have come from modern handlers.
We are talking about genetic material that has been baked into the fibers for centuries. The crazy part is that 3 separate geneticists reportedly hesitated to put their names on the final report. Why? Because the results point toward an origin that is much older and much more complex than the Middle Ages. The scientific establishment is not just skeptical, they are genuinely terrified of what these numbers imply.
If the DNA proves the cloth was in the Middle East during the 1st century,
then the carbon dating from 1988, which claimed it was a 13th century fake, is completely wrong, and that is putting it lightly. Scientists have found that the linen fibers are coated in a thin layer of starch and sugar, which can actually trap newer carbon and skew testing results by hundreds of years. So, the data we relied on for decades might have been flawed from the very start.
but the DNA is just the tip of the iceberg.
Barrie Schwortz, who is a high-level technical photographer for NASA, found things on the cloth that should not be physically possible. When you look at the shroud in a photographic negative, it reveals a perfect, detailed human figure. Medieval artists did not even understand the concept of a photographic negative. Yet here it is, etched onto a piece of cloth centuries before the invention of the camera. It shows lash marks, facial features, and even the tiny holes in the wrists where the physical trauma occurred. There are no brush strokes, no pigments, and no dyes. Basically, there is no physical evidence that a human hand ever touched a brush to this fabric. The thing is, researchers have tried to replicate this image using every modern tool available. We have high-powered lasers, sophisticated chemical baths, and digital imaging. But we still cannot create a duplicate that matches the shroud's unique characteristics. The image is only on the very top layer of the fibers, less than a fraction of an inch deep. It does not soak through the fabric like paint would. It is almost as if the image was projected onto the cloth by a sudden, intense burst of energy. Some physicists believe it would take a radiation event more powerful than anything we can produce to scorch an image like this without burning the cloth to a crisp. The historical records of the cloth tell a story that the mainstream world is trying to ignore. The NASA expert and the skeptic's journey. Yeah, about that NASA connection. Barrie Schwortz was not a man of faith when he started this journey. He was a professional skeptic who made a living debunking things for the government. When he was asked to join the team to examine the shroud in 1978, he figured he would find a painting within 10 minutes and go back to his free Italian vacation. He even joked with his colleagues that they would find the artist's signature in the corner. But here is the deal. After 5 days of working around the clock, running tests for 120 hours straight, he couldn't find a single trace of paint. During that investigation, the team used a device called a VP8 image analyzer. This was the same tech NASA used to map the terrain of the Moon and Mars. When they put a normal photo into the machine, the image came out distorted and flat. But when they put the Shroud's image into the analyzer, something impossible happened. The image translated into a perfect three-dimensional map of a human body. This proves that the image on the cloth contains three-dimensional data that a flat painting or a photograph simply cannot hold. How could a medieval forger encode three-dimensional depth into a piece of linen? Hands down, there is no explanation for it. Schwortz spent 18 years refusing to believe his own data. He was looking for one specific reason to call it a fake, and he thought he found it in the blood. The blood stains on the shroud are bright red. Now, anyone who has ever seen a dried scab knows that blood turns brown or black after a few hours. So Schwortz assumed the red marks were just red paint. It made sense, right? But then he met a biochemist named Alan Adler, another Jewish scientist who didn't have a religious horse in the race. Adler performed a chemical analysis on the red spots and found that they were not paint at all. They were actual human blood. The reason the blood stayed red is actually heart-wrenching. When a human body goes through extreme, prolonged trauma, like the kind described in the historical accounts of the crucifixion, the liver starts pumping out a chemical called bilirubin. When bilirubin levels are that high, the blood stays permanently red. It never turns brown. This means the blood on the shroud is the biological record of a man who suffered through an amount of physical trauma that is almost beyond human comprehension. Schwortz realized in that moment that he wasn't looking at a piece of art. He was looking at a crime scene. Despite this, the academic world stayed quiet because the implications were too big to handle. If the blood is real and the image is not a painting, then we are left with a mystery that threatens the foundations of modern secular history. Schwortz found himself in a position where he had to choose between his comfortable skepticism and the undeniable evidence in front of his eyes. He chose the evidence, even though it meant his colleagues would look at him differently for the rest of his life. He launched a database to keep the information free from corporate or religious bias, because he believed the world deserved to see the raw data. The deeper they looked into the fibers, the more the laws of physics seemed to break. Mystery of the image formation. It is not that simple to just say the image is a scorch or a shadow. If you try to scorch a piece of linen, the heat travels through the fibers and leaves a mark on the other side. But on the shroud, the image is only on the surface. It is like the image was whispered onto the fabric. Scientists have noted that the image is actually a result of the dehydration and oxidation of the linen itself. This means that whatever created the image didn't add anything to the cloth. It changed the chemical structure of the fabric from the inside out. Some researchers have proposed that the image was formed by a process called corona discharge. This happens when a massive amount of electricity or radiation is released from a central point. If a body were to suddenly emit a burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation, it could, in theory, create an image exactly like the one on the shroud. But here is the catch. We are talking about a burst of energy that would be equivalent to several thousand volts of electricity happening in a fraction of a second. There is no evidence of any machine or natural phenomenon from 2,000 years ago that could do this. And get this, the image shows the internal structures of the body, like a primitive X-ray. You can see the bones in the fingers and the roots of the teeth through the skin. This suggests that the energy that created the image didn't just come from the surface of the skin. It came from inside the man. Physicists from the Italian National Agency for New Technologies spent years trying to recreate even a square inch of this image using high-powered lasers. They found that they could mimic the color, but they couldn't get the three-dimensional data or the surface-only depth. Basically, they concluded that the technology to create the shroud doesn't exist today, let alone in the Middle Ages. What most people do not realize is that the image also contains information about the person's physical state that matches the historical record perfectly. There are over 120 lash marks from a Roman whip called a flagrum, which had lead weights at the ends. The marks are in a geometric pattern that shows two different people were doing the whipping, one taller than the other. You can see the swelling in the cheeks, the broken nose, and the puncture marks around the scalp from a crown made of thorns. Every single detail is medically accurate to a degree that no medieval artist could have known. So, we have a piece of cloth that acts as a photographic negative, contains three-dimensional data, shows internal X-ray features, and is chemically changed at a level we cannot reproduce.
The DNA evidence is adding a layer of geographic complexity that makes it impossible to be a local European fake.
The markers from India suggest the linen itself might have been traded along the Silk Road, which was common for high-quality fabrics in the 1st century.
This would explain why the DNA of rare plants from that region was found on the fibers.
The evidence is staring them in the face, but they choose to look away.
DNA bombshell. When specialized researchers finally got their hands on viable DNA from the shroud, they expected to see a few traces of Italian DNA
and maybe some Middle Eastern markers. But what they actually found was a global map.
There was DNA from South Asia, specifically the north of India. There was DNA from East Asia and North Africa.
This was not just a few stray strands from a handler. These markers were embedded in the dust and the fibers throughout the cloth. It is almost as if the cloth had traveled through every major trade route of the ancient world. The crazy part is that some of these markers belong to ethnic groups that were very isolated during the Middle Ages. If a forger in France in 1350 created this,
how did he get Indian DNA and North African plant pollen onto the fabric?
He couldn't have. It is simply not possible. This suggests the cloth has been around much longer than we thought and has been venerated by people from all over the world.
The DNA from the Middle East is the most prominent, and it matches the types found in ancient Palestinian populations from the 1st century. Researchers found mitochondrial DNA,
which is passed down from the mother, and it showed a very specific lineage that is rare in Europe, but common in the Levant. Some geneticists have privately whispered that they found sequences that appear to be corrupted or fragmented in a way that suggests extreme age or exposure to radiation. If the radiation theory of image formation is true,
it would have a massive effect on the DNA samples.
It might even be why some of the sequences are so hard to map. The energy burst that created the image might have shattered parts of the genetic code. But here is the catch. The academic community has been very slow to publish these findings. There is a lot of pressure to keep the shroud in the category of a religious mystery rather than a scientific fact. Barrie Schwortz has seen this firsthand. He has watched as major news outlets take small, out-of-context pieces of his work and use them to claim the shroud is a fake. He has spent the last 30 years correcting the record, but the truth is hard to hear when people have already made up their minds. He even found that the carbon dating samples from 1988 were taken from a corner of the cloth that had been repaired by medieval nuns after a fire. This means the scientists were dating a patch, not the original shroud. When you date a piece of fabric that was sewn in the Middle Ages to fix a hole, of course, the results will say it is from the Middle Ages. But when you look at the main body of the cloth, the weave is a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern that was common in 1st century Judea, but virtually unknown in medieval Europe. The weight of the fabric, the style of the loom, and the specific type of linen all point to one time and one place, Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago? Is the Shroud of Turin the actual burial cloth of a man who conquered death? Or is it a trick that we still haven't figured out? If this evidence is true, are we missing the biggest story in human history? Like and subscribe for more mysteries, and tell me your thoughts in the comments.